Conditions are applied by Unraveling Truth. A fanfic of a fanfiction takes place during what chapter 114 of Conditions May Apply. Point of view of one Katsuki Bakugou and his experiences the morning of the sports festival leading up to the first round. The day had come. Getting into UA had been the first step in his long quest to become the #1 hero. With the sports festival looming before him, making his way to first place was the most logical course of action. Not only would he get first place, he'd make sure it was indisputable. With a perfect victory record, every single person in Japan would have their eyes on him. Heroes would recognize his raw talent, and villains would be wise to clean up their act before he hit the scene. On a day as great as this, you'd think he would be overjoyed. As he gazed in the mirror, a scowl was all he'd been met with. His perfect day out in the sun, and yet his rightful place as the one who'd give a speech was taken right from underneath him. It was bad enough that Half and Half seemed to have a strong quirk on him, but for a useless Deku, of all things, to be above him in some way, it just didn't make any sense. Splashing water across his face, he gave his uniform a once-over, stomping his way down the stairs once he was satisfied. With the familiar scent of breakfast striking his nose, he rounded the corner to spot his parents sitting around the table. With a gruff greeting tossed out, he pulled out his own seat, sliding his plate closer to himself. Right as he was about to dig in, the clearing of a throat nearby made him look up, his trademark scowl intensifying at the culprit. "Katsuki, where are your manners?" came the all-too-familiar screech of his mother. "Huh? I said mornin', didn't I?" he shouted out, matching her volume all too easily. The mother and son held a heated staring contest, neither daring to blink or even consider giving the other an inch of ground. His stubborn streak had come from somewhere, and he wasn't about to start his day off by backing down from anyone. The only thing that spared them from wasting the day away was the ruffle of a newspaper and a light chuckle from the side. Now, dear, I'm sure it's just nerves from the big day," his dad chuckled, glancing over at Katsuki. "You're gonna do great, kid. Do your best, all right?" "He'd better! And don't even think about doing anything stupid out there. Got that?" followed soon after, his mom doubling down on her glare. With a scoff, he simply rolled his eyes, finally having the peace required to eat. He'd worked hard to get into UA, and he'd certainly worked hard in preparation for today. He knew he was above damn near everyone in his class, even if a voice in the back of his mind oh so helpfully supplied that he had competition. Deku may have gotten some spotlight during that incident, but this was his chance to show the world that he was here. Stomping his way out of the door, his grip tightened around the strap of his backpack, glaring ahead as he kicked it closed behind him. As he stormed towards the train station, he attempted to steady his breathing. It wouldn't do him any good to lose his cool this early, especially when he had an entire festival to focus on. Scowling at the passing scenery, he made up his mind to focus on the day ahead of him rather than his crappy morning. He now stood in the waiting room with all the other extras, getting in some last-minute stretches. It was too late to get in any further practice, and he knew that he had exhausted every single option in preparation. He was ready. There was no denying it. He knew that he had what it took to make it to the top. All he had to do was leap over the hurdles that was everyone else in his year, make it to first, and put on a damn good showing while he was at it. They'd all know who Katsuki Bakugou was by the end of this, and he could only get higher from here. Except some people clearly did not get the memo. His eyes narrowed from his corner of the room, gazing directly at two of the threats on his mind. Of all the people in this class, that half and half bastard decided to wage war with Deku, of all people? Was he too blind to realize who he should be focusing on? Small explosions popped into existence from his palms, his mood worsening the longer they spoke. He'd make sure they knew better than to count him out. He ignored the flicker of a memory that crossed his mind. The scent of burnt skin, a cry of pain, a weak and useless nobody. While that quirkless, formerly quirkless, had he just hidden it? Loser might have improved since then. The same could be said for Katsuki himself. He'd worked hard to fine-tune his quirk to make sure that he had the precise control required to only put out as much force as necessary. He wouldn't have a repeat incident, especially not now on a stage as public as this. His goal to win was double-sided, to show the world his strength and to prove to himself that all his training had been for something. He tuned out the rest of the room, simply paying attention for when they'd get called up. With the rest of the class lined up, he stood with his hands in his pockets, glare flickering across the various extras scattered around them. He knew little to nothing about the other classes, and why should he when they were so beneath him? Their own skills mattered little when he knew for a fact that his own were infinitely superior. But despite all of that, he was still the one stuck in a crowd while someone else took his place at the podium. Not getting first had been a blow, for sure, but that only meant trying even harder to make up for that failure. A sneer left him as he listened to the speech. Separation this and cooperation that. The strongest hero was capable of working just fine on their own, proven by All Might himself. Cooperation was meant for the sidekicks and all the other extras who lacked the power to do anything alone. Not to mention that nonsense about quirks and people who lack them. Katsuki knew for a fact that if it weren't for that mysterious quirk that Deku had whipped out of nowhere, he wouldn't even be here. All that talk of trying to be a quirkless hero just to finally make it to the big leagues and show his true colors, at least he'd wizened up and realized he'd never come close to Katsuki's level if he didn't stop looking down on him. Herded into the tunnels of the first part of the festival, he flexed his hands, small explosions crackling out. As he took a few breaths, the sounds of the extras surrounding him were steadily filtered out. He could hear them all yapping on about how excited this was and how they wanted to look good. He'd have scoffed if he cared to give them the time of day. There was nothing fun about a competition like this, only the thrill of seeking victory. Their words were meaningless if they couldn't back it up. With a quick glance to spot the placement of everyone around him, his focus shifted toward the tunnel exit. A low gulp leaving him as he waited for the countdown to end. At the sound of the buzzer, he rushed forward into a sprint, eyes glaring ahead as he kept an eye out for any obstacles. With a squint, he spotted various students becoming stuck further up ahead, the source of the problem becoming clear soon enough. With a leap into the air, an explosion loudly erupted forth from his left, giving him the air needed to plant his feet against the wall. With an arm behind him and to his side, he let off a series of explosions, using the propulsion to run along the wall. With a snarl at the ice trap, his mood only worsened once he spotted Deku, of all people, springboarding across the various extras in the crowd who had gotten caught. He wasn't about to get left behind. As he exited the tunnel comfortably ahead of many of the extras of the other classes, he witnessed Half and Half's display of power. He watched as glaciers big enough to stop the robots in their tracks formed right in front of him. But the spectacle didn't keep his attention. His focus snapping back towards the task ahead. If that had drawn his gaze, then he could only imagine what the audience was thinking, what the public was thinking. He should be the one drawing the eyes of the rest of the world, not some nobody who inherited everything from his father. Shouting out into the open air, he aimed his palms downward, a large dual explosion bursting forth from his hands to give him an extra boost. Soaring high up into the air, he swiftly surpassed the height of the frozen robots, explosions blasting out behind him to send him forward. With his foot stomping down on the head of the machine, he boosts himself into the air even further, the sounds of ice cracking and machinery crashing down behind him. A small part of him was curious about the fate of the students behind him, but he decided that if they were even half as good as what he expected from UA, they'd be just fine. He had a race to win. Continuing to soar overhead, his gaze would eventually drift downwards as the next obstacle came into play. While most people would actually have to use the wires to cross, the height he acquired, along with his own quirk, would prove useful in invalidating that obstacle entirely. Of course, despite the advantage he'd assumed he had, he spotted a familiar head of green making its way through the obstacle. He was certain that Deku had been caught up in that pile up earlier. So how had he closed the gap between them? To make matters worse, he was even outrunning him. With a growl, he boosted himself downwards, deciding that he'd have to yet again put him in his place before he worried about the soon-to-be dethroned first place. Now that he actually focused his blasts, he was rapidly gaining speed, shedding altitude to instead get as close as possible to Deku. With a snarl, he gave himself one final explosive burst, right arm outstretched as he unleashed an explosion downwards. Obviously, he wasn't planning on killing the nerd, so he'd toned down the blast significantly. It was still enough to throw him off. He was certain of that. With his point made, he launched himself forwards, snatching his second place position and rapidly moving to acquire first. Of course, nothing could ever be that simple. With a series of shock waves ringing out behind him and eventually surrounding him, he let out a shout. Flight path destabilized as the various mines went off. Eventually managing to right himself, his eyes slowly narrowed as his palms sparked off, screaming bloody murder to the sky. Was this his punishment for trying to be a proper hero? He should have just knocked him out right then and there. Deku! He shouted out, blasting himself back into the race and heading directly for the finish line. It was bad enough that the nerd had surpassed him, but just barely ahead of him, that half and half slid into second place, a trail of ice left behind him. Touching down once he'd crossed the finish line, he shook his arms out to regain feeling. Glare locked directly onto the back of Deku's skull. Again and again, he found some new way to look down on Katsuki, and it was getting really annoying. If he couldn't outshine him here and now on the big stage, who knew just how swollen that head of his would get? His mood only worsened once those extras that followed Deku around eventually showed up, praising him for giving them a free ticket to the finish line. They couldn't even do it on their own. Once the announcements rang out and stated that there would be a break between matches, he stormed off to find an area to get his head back in the game before the next match. He'd underestimated the only two worthy of any recognition, and he wouldn't make that same mistake again. With one last look at the growing number of students, he stomped away to find a place to blow off steam on his own. He might not have been able to make a pledge on the podium, but he swore to himself that he would be the one to win everything. He knew he would succeed, because that's just what a hero does. End of story.